What if the term transnational could be considered as more than just a description of a text, but also an analytic lens that can be used to break down social hierarchies and achieve a better understanding of texts? The traditional term transnational can be problematic when only considered in one understanding, but if the term were to be pluralized, then it could also include an approach to creating or receiving a text. Text can be incorrectly identified as being transnational when the text is not only created by one community of people who further others another community of people not traditionally considered within the same group, and this keeps others in an imagined transnational community. When talking about transnational equalities, there are two main distinctions important to consider: the equality of perspective and the equality of representation. The equality of perspective is what first creates a text to be distinct from another that may be within certain boundaries within a nation or culture, while another is not. The equality of representation needs to be considered because lack of one group of people with stories told is what leads to inequality and an othering of a culture not within another. A transnational approach can possibly create new alternatives to interpreting and creating text. Perhaps the term transnational can encompass more than just the standard doxa of the term that is generally accepted and believed by most. For a text to be transnational, it should be somewhat meta and contain a certain awareness about itself. The transnational text ought to be aware of the patriarchal assumptions and conventions underlying the text so that a reader can be, as Horatio Schwartz would call, a resisting reader. Almost like the transnational text is a resisting text that refuses to reiterate the social hierarchies. If transnational is considered to be more of an approach to interpreting text rather than a classification of text, being transnational is, in a sense, a terministic screen, except even more incorporating than the traditional ideology of terministic screens. Kenneth Burke identifies terministic screens as not just the skewed viewing of something as if perceived behind the metaphorical layering, camera lens, and filters, but the theory of terministic screens is that the view perceived from the screen results in some determined knowledge and a dominant perspective. That knowledge is gained from the perspective does not have to be the traditional transnational narrative of being within and out the borders of a nation and what it means to claim an identity unique of time and space, but rather a transnational approach can have a terministic screen that is aware of othering identities. Perhaps to think transnationally means to consider the equality of perspective when thinking under the Mestiza consciousness. Gloria Anzaldua's concept of the Mestiza consciousness, or the consciousness of the borderland, means to be torn between ways and is considered a product of the transfer of the cultural and spiritual values of one group to another. The Mestiza is not too different from the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of transnational as extending to having interests beyond bounds or frontiers. Because the Mestiza has a plural personality, due to being a descendant of both the Spanish traveling to the New World and enslaved natives, Anzaldua is able to be flexible and converge to a new perspective that includes, not excludes. If the term transnational were to be pluralized as the Mestiza consciousness is, then reconciliation may be achieved. For instance, a transnational text should not just present itself as containing social hierarchies. It ought to say why social hierarchies exist, which groups are unapologetically promoting them, and only then can those groups who have claimed power begin to ask those groups considered lesser within the hierarchy, just as Anzaldua commanded of whites rejecting Chicano people. This is very similar to the war of the community stated in traditional transnational texts, but could be considered more about the deliberate othering. If Stanley Fish's idea that a reader's ability to understand a text is subject to that reader's belonging in a particular interpretive community is true, then how would an interpretive community ever be able to understand the traditional doxa of transnational text? That is, if there is an interpretive community that is interpreting a transnational text, that is of or from the same interpretive community, then the interpretive community could not understand said text. Because the interpretive community has certain beliefs, ideologies, experiences, and influences that are different from the interpretive community where the transnational text came from, there is no true understanding with the original notion of a transnational text. When texts are considered transnational in a singular definition, Fish's interpretive community exists, naturally, as the one interpreting, while some other imagined transnational community must also exist in order to be interpreted by Fish's interpretive community. The imagined transnational community stems from Benedict Anderson's term community that inhibits the transnational zone of safety and construes human life in the zone of suffering as the West's other. The imagined transnational community becomes a group of people that a text places in a realm that further reiterates these social hierarchies. This only further prevents the equality of perspective. As for the equality of representation, Sue Hum's problems associated with the racialized gaze can also be seen as problems when classifying a text as transnational. Transnational text and the racialized gaze seek to organize reality into one real and natural socio-historical construct, but this only trivializes and erases racial identity, as well as replicates the cultural value system of the status quo. When a text is trying to be so-called transnational by describing race and aims to be authentic to that race, the text becomes problematic because aiming for authenticity means judging whether individuals from a culture fulfill correct or even native race-related characteristics. Authenticity treats race as an aesthetic that simulates realism by reducing race to simple icons and stereotypes. But the problem with texts attempting to be transnational is that denying deep differences only creates a larger divide of the social hierarchies that can only be understood through the transnational approach. Similarly, Hum's notion that universality, or the assumption of sameness, or that all people have the same needs and desires, simulates naturalism. Yet, this is also problematic of the transnational approach because it trivializes and erases racial identity. A transnational text may contain Hum's view from nowhere, in which viewing is a natural and unmediated experience that everyone sees in the same way. Yet this transnational approach would see the view from somewhere, in which vision challenges on how it can be influenced by socio-historical ideology. One way to correct the racialized gaze is to consider who is telling the narratives of these transnational texts and question why should text be read in a transnational lens rather than labeling the text itself as transnational. Hans Robert Jauss says that a reader's aesthetic experience is bound by time, space, and horizons of expectations, and these horizons of expectations are similar to a historical context in that the reader's expectations or frame of reference when interpreting a new text is based on his or her past experiences of literature and preconceived notions about literature. If this is true, then the amount of stories being told from particular narratives matter. Otherwise, unequal selection of texts from multiple nations would indirectly sway the horizons of expectations. For example, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie stresses the consequences of not having multiple stories told by the many voices of every culture, race, gender, religion, etc. in her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. Adichie notes how those not within the culture may fail to accurately view these voices if only one voice is being heard, and therefore assigned to be representative of all. Adichie draws examples from her childhood when she wrote fictional stories about white characters with blue eyes, simply because the only stories she was exposed to as a child were ones with white characters with blue eyes. Though she may have loved these stories and may have been able to relate to the protagonists, Adichie draws a paradoxical positioning between herself and the protagonist from these stories she was othered by. Adichie mentions the Igbo word Nankali, which loosely translates as to be greater than another. She uses this term because not recognizing a greater amount of Western narratives compared to the narratives of all people creates a power imbalance and therefore a lack of texts that can be approached in a transnational way. Traditional understanding of transnational would show how Adichie can be of a culture not within the nation or realm where these characters exist, yet she still can relate to them. It does not matter that these stories she read were not necessarily transnational, but she took a transnational approach when she related to the text and took ownership of the narrative. But perhaps a transnational approach can go beyond these simple explanations. Adichie may explain the danger of a single story, but what should be stressed is that until these multiple narratives begin to be told and a leveled horizon of expectation is achieved, it may not even be possible to begin to understand a story from the transnational lens. After all, if there is one interpretive community who is reading the text of another imagined transnational community that only has a small number of texts, then the interpretive community cannot even begin to understand the imagined transnational community. And because of this, the social hierarchies are reiterated by the fact that there are more narratives being told by the interpretive community than the imagined transnational community. Instead of reinforcing social hierarchies similar to a system of domination and subordination like imperialism, in which there is an imperial center and a periphery, a transnational text can instead explore why one is deemed the imperial center and the other is the periphery. By questioning the assigned roles, there is a better understanding that can lead to discussion of who are these real people that are in these imagined transnational communities. The imagined transnational community is made of real people who are placed in imaginary roles that other them. Wendy S. Hesford notes how transnational human rights imaginary is neither a static entity nor a totalizing global discourse. Rather, it is a differentially available formation, meaning a new understanding of the term transnational and what the term can mean. Understanding not only a single text, but multiple texts and their relationships to one another intercontextually is key to the transnational approach. The discursive formation Hesford proposes does not assign roles to the human rights subjects, but instead constitutes and connects subjects through technologies and rationalities, individuals and national states, corporations and the state and non-state actors for negotiations. This allows for cooperation among subjects and creates communication, rather than assigning one to be part of the interpretive community and the other part of the imagined transnational community. If transnational is not accepted as an approach, it will forever be known as a characteristic of text that are stuck in the zone of suffering. Perhaps the term transnational does not have to be restricted to a single quality or characteristic of a text, or even a set of qualities that are contained within a text, but instead can be a pluralized term that can expand upon the additional conditions in which certain equalities are and are not present when understanding a text through a transnational approach.